On the morning of December 8, 1941, the United States Navy was, by all appearances, a broken force. The backbone of the Pacific Fleet, the great battleships, lay in the mud of Pearl Harbor, billowing thick, oily smoke that choked the Hawaiian sky. To the Japanese high command, the Americans were finished. But what they failed to see beneath the wreckage was a terrifying industrial reality. The U.S. Navy wasn't just a collection of ships, it was a burgeoning mechanical organism. While the world watched the sinking hulls, the first gears of a logistical machine were already turning, preparing to launch a counteroffensive of a scale the world had never seen. But how could a nation that just lost its primary strike force hope to outpace a seasoned imperial power?
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
When we think of naval power, we think of 16-inch guns and roaring fighter planes. However, the true secret of American strength lay in the mundane. While Japan built masterpieces of naval engineering like the Yamato, the U.S. focused on service squadrons. These were floating cities, repair ships, concrete fuel barges, and even ice cream ships. At this stage of the war, the U.S. realized that a warship is only as strong as its proximity to a wrench and a fuel line. What most people don't realize is that the U.S. Navy was the first in history to master underway replenishment, the art of refueling and rearming at full speed in heavy seas. This capability created a ghost logistics chain, but it required a breakthrough in something far more invisible than fuel: information. Beyond the steel and oil, the U.S. Navy possessed a weapon that didn't fire a single bullet: the Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific, or FRUPAC. Hidden in a basement in Hawaii, cryptanalysts worked in a windowless room nicknamed the Dungeon. They weren't just reading Japanese codes, they were learning the tonal signatures of individual Japanese radio operators. They could identify specific enemy ships not by their names, but by the fist, the unique rhythm, of the man tapping the telegraph key. Why did this granular level of detail matter so much at that moment? Because it turned the vast Pacific into a glass pond. Knowledge of the enemy's location was useless, however, if your own weapons failed to detonate upon arrival. In the first 2 years of the war, U.S. submarine captains were returning to port in tears of rage. They had the Japanese in their crosshairs, fired perfect spreads, and watched their torpedoes bounce harmlessly off enemy hulls or dive deep into the abyss. The Mark 14 torpedo was a technical marvel on paper, featuring a complex magnetic influence exploder, but it was a disaster in practice. It was a critical factor that nearly cost the U.S. the underwater war. The Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit the flaws, blaming the captains instead. How could such a flawed strategy succeed? The answer lay in a radical shift in how the Navy measured strength. While Japan struggled to replace even a single lost fleet carrier, the American shipyards began a feat of mass production that bordered on the supernatural. Between 1943 and 1945, the U.S. launched an Essex-class carrier every few months. These weren't just ships, they were standardized platforms for power. A critical factor in this development was the shift from riveting to welding, which allowed hulls to be assembled in sections like a child's toy. By the end of the war, the U.S. Navy had more ships than all other navies in the world combined. But a ship is a hollow shell without the men to fly the planes, and the Navy's training program was about to change everything. Early in the war, the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was the undisputed king of the sky, faster, more agile, and piloted by veterans with years of combat experience. For many Americans at the time, engaging a Zero was a death sentence. To counter this, Commander John Thatch developed a defensive maneuver known as the Thatch Weave. It didn't rely on outflying the Zero, but on teamwork. Two pilots would weave toward each other, baiting the enemy into the line of fire of their wingmen. It was a cold, calculated shift from individual dogfighting to a coordinated system of destruction. The hardware was catching up too, and it came in the form of a rugged beast nicknamed the Ensign Eliminator. And to the F-6F Hellcat. Unlike the Japanese philosophy of sacrificing armor for speed, the Hellcat was built like a tank. It featured a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, heavy cockpit armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks. If a Hellcat pilot made a mistake, he usually survived to learn from it. In contrast, Japan's best pilots were dying in unarmored planes, their experience vanishing in a plume of smoke. What most people realize now is that the US Navy wasn't just building better planes, it was preserving its most valuable resource, human experience. This preservation of talent would lead to the most one-sided air battle in history. By June 1944, the disparity in strength was no longer a gap, it was a canyon. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American radar, another overlooked strategic factor, detected Japanese strikes from over 100 miles away. US controllers used high-frequency radio to guide Hellcats directly into the enemy's path. The result was so lopsided that a pilot famously remarked, "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot." Japan lost nearly 300 aircraft in a single day. Why did this outcome matter so much? Because it effectively ended the Japanese naval air arm as a functional fighting force. But as the Japanese fleet withered, they turned to a tactic born of desperation, one that challenged the very psyche of the US Navy. The emergence of the kamikaze, suicide pilots, brought a new kind of terror. To counter this, the US deployed its most secret weapon of the war, second only to the atomic bomb, the VT proximity fuse. Inside a 5-inch shell was a tiny ruggedized radio transmitter. It didn't need to hit the plane, it just needed to get close. When the radio waves bounced back, the shell exploded, shredding the aircraft with a wall of shrapnel. At this stage of the war, American science was essentially automating the act of shooting down an enemy. Yet, even with these technological marvels, the Navy still faced the daunting task of sustaining millions of men across 60 million square miles of ocean. What is often overlooked is that the US Navy eventually stopped relying on permanent bases like Pearl Harbor. They created a massive floating base at Ulithi Atoll. At its peak, there were more ships anchored in this remote lagoon than in any port on Earth. It featured floating dry docks that could lift a 10,000-ton cruiser out of the water for repairs in the middle of the ocean. This was the ultimate expression of American strength, the ability to bring the shipyard to the front lines. How could a traditional empire hope to compete with a mobile, industrial continent? The sheer volume of supplies was staggering, even including the luxuries of home. By the time the surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in 1945, the US Navy was no longer just a fleet. It was a global hegemon, a fusion of science, industry, and brutal tactical adaptation. Its strength didn't just come from the number of its guns, but from the depth of its logistics and the resilience of its technology. It had transformed from a victim of a surprise attack into the most dominant maritime force in human history. As we look back, we must ask, was this victory the result of better courage, or simply the inevitable outcome of an industrial giant finding its footing? The Pacific War ended in 1945, but the blueprint for modern naval power was only just beginning. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing for more content about the United States in World War II. Thank you for watching.